Gents, welcome to the final session of the Burma Campaign, our virtual tour with Rob Lyman. First off, I want to make a quick apology about yesterday's session, which didn't happen. We had a problem broadcasting from Myanmar, which meant none of the session happened at all. And I apologize because I'm aware that many of you were logging in and trying to access the tour. Others had scheduled the evening around the tour, so I really am sorry for the inconvenience caused. But we're here today. And we have an extended session. So Rob's going to be given time to go through all of his planned content for yesterday, for day 6, and his thoughts on the Burma campaign, which was scheduled for day 7. So we're going to allow Rob enough time to get through the content, as well as time for your questions and comments, as always. So enough from me. Let's crack right on. Rob, if you're ready, I'll hand over to you.
Well, hello everyone, and really good to see everyone online again tonight. I hope you're wearing your hats and you've taken your mepicrine if that's what you do, and you've got a cup of tea from the Lost Tea Company in front of you. We're going to continue our journey through the Burma campaign tonight, and it won't be a problem bringing it all together. And I won't be too long. I just want to make a couple of observations at the start. I think what I'll do is I'll go through the presentation for what I think I called Meiktila and the race to Rangoon or something like that. So essentially it's the end of 1944 and the start of 1945, and we'll take you through the reversal of 1942. This is the good news story if you're a Brit. And what I'll do is I'll then go straight into the next presentation, which is a series of impressions and reflections that I've had about the campaign. And I've just picked these up from the last week. I mean, clearly I've been involved in thinking and studying about the campaign now for a long time, but I thought I'd just go back and refresh myself in terms of what's made a new impression on me this week. Well, let's start by having a little look. We know where we are in terms of session 6 and session 7 tonight. But what I want to do is spend a little bit of time talking through the process by which Burma was reconquered. And it's worth also saying at the start that the intention was not to reconquer Burma. When you talk about reconquering a place, it is very much delivers a sense of perhaps imperialism, perhaps intent that it's important to recover a country because that country belongs to you, or you want to be able to do something for strategic reasons or political reasons that aren't particularly associated to the fighting. Well, Burma's unique, or it's different in that respect, because the reconquest of Burma, first of all, wasn't really planned in 1944. It happened, and I'll talk about why it happened. It was really serendipity. But there was no intention to recover Burma for Burma's sake. What I'm trying to say is that the intention was to defeat the Japanese, to remove the Japanese from Burma. And once that exercise had been undertaken, then to hand Burma back to its proper political authorities, that's the British government, with the Burma government responsible for the delivery of governmental functions in the country, and anything associated with plans for the decolonialization of the country, so the advancement of the independence process in Burma, was nothing really to do with the advancing armies. Although, of course, the application of military force does always have political consequences, and I'll touch on a few of those as we go through tonight. But when you talk about the reconquest, it was really the defeat of the Japanese in Burma, not the recovery of the political entity of Burma that we're talking about. The 5 phases that I've decided to break it down into, first of all, is the pursuit of Motoguchi's legions in India after the collapse of Yugo. I'll talk about that very briefly. We'll then talk about Slim's approach to the coming battle and the plans that he made to go back into Burma. There was a change of plan. We'll come to that in a moment. We'll then talk about the main battles for the Irrawaddy shore, which were between a place called Meiktila and Mandalay. And then finally, we'll talk about the route down to Burma, down to Rangoon rather, before the rains fell in May 1945. So those are the phases. We'll just walk them through separately now. And hopefully these maps have been saved for you. They're very complicated. I drafted these for my book Slim Master War many years ago, and I was very conscious of the fact that I didn't want to leave anything out, but actually they're quite complicated. They're full of military map symbols. So what I'll do is I'll quickly just orientate you to the map first so that you know where we are. And then I'll give you some broad brushstrokes. First thing to do is to look up here at Kohima. There's Kohima. Well, let's start at Dimapur. We're in the Brahmaputra Valley. If we went up the Brahmaputra Valley towards Jorhat and Lido, we'd meet the Americans and the Chinese at Lido. Instead, we're going to come across the road through Nishigard to Kohima, and then down through Kanglatongbi into Imphal, which is where my red dot is now. Well, that will indicate that the Chindwin is running down this way here. And the Chindwin, of course, is in Burma. If we carried on down the Tidum Road down here, we'd come to Tongzan and then finally to Tidum and Kennedy Peak. If you go there nowadays, it's quite possible to go down there into the Lushai Hills, the Chin Hills rather. Then you can, it's quite extraordinary countryside, but and well worth the trip if you can arrange it. I know some people who will be very happy to transport you down there should you wish. Now, we've already talked about the Road of Bones. So Mutaguchi has decided that really at the end of June, he's got no choice but to supervise the withdrawal of the troops that his own divisional commanders have initiated largely of their own accord. In the south, General Yanagida has been sacked and replaced, first of all, by his deputy, a man called Tanaka, and then replaced fully by another man called Tanaka, same name, different man. And Yanagida goes away and is removed from command. In the north, as we now know, Sato is now moving back quickly, back through the hills via Ukral and the tracks that lead down to the Chindwin at Homolin and across the Chindwin. This is a very, very desperate affair for the Japanese because they fight all the way. They're now starving, they're eating grass and leaves, and many, many, many of the casualties that are sustained by the entire 15th Army are actually sustained during this terrible retreat. Now, this talks to a failure, in my view, of the Japanese commanders to pay any real attention to the lives and the futures of their soldiers. And this was something the Japanese did very well. Japanese commanders actually did a great job at killing their soldiers. They wouldn't have gone down very well in the Western Army, certainly not in the 1940s during the Second World War. But during the Second World War in the Far East, Japanese commanders excelled at killing their own troops. And it's a great tragedy, really is a great tragedy. They excelled at doing this through incompetence and through lack of planning and poor attention to the lives of their men. But we'll move on from that. It's worth just talking very quickly now about what implications this withdrawal had on British planners. Well, it's fair to say that even in August let me just say, in terms of the Road of Bones, the last formal Japanese soldiers left at the end, about the 28th of August, we think, crossing the Chindwin. I just also need to say that at no stage did the Japanese withdrawal become a rout. The Japanese fought every step of the way, and it still amazes me to read of reports of Japanese snipers on road starving to death with 3 or 4 rounds left in them and a grenade to commit harikari when they fired those 3 rounds off. You know, they absolutely fought every yard of the journey back across those 150, 160 miles to the Chindwin. And the reports that you can read of British soldiers, British and Indian soldiers, particularly in the 23rd Brigade, the Long Range Penetration Brigade, coming across large numbers of Japanese bodies decomposing quickly in the jungle are extraordinary. Anyway, by August 1944, the fact that there had been an extraordinary victory in Manipur and Assam had passed most people in Delhi and London by. They'd spent the last 3 or 4 years panicking massively about Japanese military success, worrying massively about British military and British and Indian military failures, that the idea that there might be an astounding victory on the cards in Manipur and Assam just completely passed them by. And there's some very funny exchanges, funny in retrospect, exchanges between Alan Brooke, who's the Chief of the Imperial General Staff in London, and some of his staff officers about their fears that things weren't going to be going too well in Manipur and the Japanese were going to win again. It's a little reminder that when you contemplate and cogitate and comment on military operations, make sure you're as well as informed as you can. We had a situation where Mountbatten's own chief of staff, otherwise fabulous man, was complaining in July that actually he thought there'd be failure in Imphal because he didn't understand what was going on. Fortunately, the men who were on the ground, well, certainly in Shillong, Slim did know what was going on, and he recognized that there was a significant victory about to be achieved. And he looked a couple of months forward and came up with the conclusion, which Mountbatten immediately agreed with, that actually what the forces in Assam needed to do was to follow up aggressively against the Japanese to make sure that their defeat was comprehensive. There's no point just sitting in Imphal and resting on your laurels and saying, well done, despite the fact that we're still in the middle of the monsoon, remember, and it's very wet, and movement is very, very difficult. It was very important for Slim to continue to fight. Now, he persuaded Mountbatten of that. Mountbatten agreed readily and put a recommendation to London that he, Mountbatten, be given authority to proceed across the Chindwin in the dry weather, i.e. the period when the monsoon ended in October, November. London prevaricated. They gave him some provisional permissions to continue with the pursuit, but it wasn't actually until September that London agreed to a formal offensive across the Chindwin into Upper Burma, so the area north of the Irrawaddy and east of the Chindwin, at the end of the rainy season. So we're talking about November. So that was good news so far as Slim was concerned. In fact, he was operating at the time very quickly to ensure that that happened. And that's really the story of 1944. The Four Corps and the troops have been fighting intensively in the battle, were rested briefly, whilst units that hadn't been so actively engaged, the East African Division in particular, and the 5th Indian Division. 5th Indian Division was moved out. Briggs's division had been flown in from Arakan, had been fighting heavily in the north, but it hadn't been there for the entire duration of the siege. Started moving up down the Tidham Road, clearing the road from the survivors of the 33rd Division. And the East African Brigade started going down the Kalor Valley, which is this one here, from Moray and Tamu down the Kalor Valley to Kalemio. And once they got there, they were then going to move effectively, turn left and go to Kaliwa on the Chindwin, which is what they did. So by December, the rains had finished now. The 5th Division had cleared the Japanese from Tidham and Fort Kennedy and moved on down towards Kalemio across the mountains. They met up in December with the East Africans who had inched down the Kaliwa Valley in the midst of terrible monsoon and in the face of very, very significant Japanese opposition to reach Kaliwa at the end of November, early December, at which stage Slim immediately threw a bridge over the river. It was a Bailey Bridge, and it was the longest Bailey Bridge ever built, something like 1,100 yards across the, and I think I've got a photograph of it somewhere, a Bailey Bridge across the river, and he started pushing his troops across. Troops were also crossing at the north at Moore Lake using canvas boats. And Slim's attention, it will be obvious to you, it was to keep the pressure on Mochiguchi's withdrawing forces and to make use of the vacuum that occurs in a retreat before the Japanese have an opportunity to turn around and to construct viable defenses. Timing is the essence here. When you're chasing a defeated enemy or a retreating enemy or a withdrawing enemy, the key thing is to stay on their coattails, because it's by staying on the coattails that you can then influence decisions that they make and things that they do. If you're not there, then you lose the initiative and the enemy starts doing things that you haven't planned for. Now, very quickly, Slim's plan. What was his plan for the next phase. I'm going to show you a little bit of Google Earth in a moment. And Slim had been, one thing I haven't mentioned, but it's very interesting, and that is that Slim had been getting quite an extraordinary amount of very, very good intelligence from Ultra, from the Bletchley Park equivalent in India of signals intelligence from the Japanese. The Japanese signal security was porous. They had very, very poor signal security, and a lot of information had been gathered by Slim over the last year by means of a very, very dedicated wireless intercept team called the WEC. And this information was given to a very, very small number of identified people. So in the headquarters 14th Army, for instance, only 2 people received the information from Ultra. One was Slim, and there was another guy involved in the receipt of this intelligence. So it was kept on very, very close hold. In fact, no one knew about it until about 1976. Anyway, what Slim knew was that there was a new Japanese commander in Burma called General Kimura. General Kimura had been on the war board in Tokyo. He was a very senior man. General Pyawbwe, who we've met and said farewell to, had left, he'd gone back to Japan. General Kimura came, and he had prepared a number of very significant logistical dumps of ammunition, food, and so on the northern side of the Irrawaddy, and intelligence made this clear. And so Slim started developing a plan to engage, to attract, engage, and defeat the Japanese in the area of Upper Burma, north of the Irrawaddy. And we generally call this the Shwebo Plain. And let me just show you now on the map the area where I'm talking about. So here we are. We've got the Chindwin coming down here. So Kaliwa is up here, right at the top, and if you follow the river down, the Chindwin is one of the most fascinating rivers in the world. Again, you need to be there when it's slightly higher than the dry season. So October, November is probably a very good time to go to the Chindwin, because there's a lot of post monsoon water in the river, and you don't get stuck on sandbanks. Moniwa, where Slim fought a battle in 1942, it comes all the way down here and joins below the map there with the Irrawaddy, which comes up here. This is the Irrawaddy itself. Mandalay's here. Shwebo is actually here. And this area here is, they call it, it's called a plain. Slim called it a plain. People refer to it at the time as a plain. It's actually quite hilly, but it's not as hilly as Manipur, and is not as hilly as the hills in Shan State. So it's flatter. There is a series of mountains running along here in the middle, but there is lots and lots of opportunity for battle in a very different way to that had been fought in the previous year. Lots of low-lying scrub, lots of open ground, lots of area for tank maneuver, lots of area for artillery concentrations. It's an area where actually a conventional soldier can, for the first time perhaps, exploit the capabilities that he has in terms of combined armed warfare, armor, artillery, mechanized infantry, and integrated air power, which characterized British and Allied forces, the 14th Army, by the end of 1944, and Slim thought would be a significantly better army than what the Japanese could oppose him with in 1944. And Slim was right. So what Slim prepared to do in a nutshell was to fight a battle in this area north of the Irrawaddy, where my red blob is at the moment, where he had already identified the Japanese had laid lots of defensive plans. So he assumed that Kimura would come across from Mandalay, cross the Irrawaddy, and fight in this area here. Kimura, however, was a very smart man, and the last thing he wanted to do was fight something that was probably Kawabe's plan, which is why the logistics dumps had been placed there. There's another point about the logistics dumps, just as an aside. Japanese tended to not have elongated lines of communication. We made that comment 2 days ago about the battles in Imphal. what they tended to do was take all their logistics with them and dump them in one place and use that and resupply that rather than resupplying with forward troops, and use that basically as a logistics hub in order to sustain military operations. A different concept to having a live line of communications running into your operational maneuver teams, your battalions and divisions, your brigades and divisions who are fighting the battle, which of course was very much a European concept. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, Kimura said, no, I'm not going to fight Slim where I know he's going to be stronger. I know he's going to have aircraft and tanks and mechanized infantry and artillery. I'm going to fight him below the Irrawaddy, and I'm going to fight him, I think I'm going to fight him north of Mandalay here, where where the little red blob is, and I'm going to fight him around this part of the Irrawaddy. And he called it the prospective battle of the Irrawaddy shore. Now, he was very sensible. He's a smart man. The last thing he should have done, the last thing he wanted to do, was to go across the Irrawaddy and fight the Japanese where he was weak, where he'd have a mighty river at his back, where he's, all the advantages would lie with Slim. So here we have Slim charging across, having been given permission, charging across the Chindwin way up here in December. And just as an aside, we've got Slim coming across here, the 19th and the 20th Indian Divisions coming across towards Shwebo, and the idea was that one division would drop down here and another division, the 19th, would cross the Irrawaddy up here, and the furthest reaches, or the further reaches of the Irrawaddy where it was less well defended, and cross down on the eastern side of Mandalay, so that we'd have the 33rd Corps advancing as the vanguard of the 14th Army onto Mandalay. So where the battle was fought here with the 4th and the 33rd Corps would have troops on the eastern side as well. So there'd be an opportunity for an outflanking maneuver against Mandalay. Of course, with Kimura withdrawing behind the barrier that the Irrawaddy provided, meant that Slim now had to change his plan. So that comes to the next stage. Well, we've talked about phase 2, and here's the picture I promised of the very long Bailey Bridge over the Irrawaddy. And when you go to Kaliwa now, I've only been to Kaliwa once, but if you go there now, you can get a sense of where this Bailey Bridge is, although there's no evidence remaining. Of course, every time the monsoon comes, it washes everything away. So, but it is an absolutely fascinating place, Kaliwa. Right, and actually, as an aside, when we do this trip next year or whenever we can get it done, I'd like to take you all up to Kaliwa, because that journey, the journey up the Chindwin is quite remarkable. It just gives you a sense of the enormity of the geography and of the climate and of the terrain generally here. We are talking about, operating over most of Western Europe. It's really, really quite extraordinary. And the only way you can really get your head around the Burma campaign is to understand its enormity in geographical terms. Well, let's move on from phase 2 to phase 3. We had Slim's had to change his plan, and I've just flicked a couple of pictures up here, really, to all taken from 1944-45. This picture up at the top left, this chap here is Punch Cowan of the 17th Indian Division. There are a couple of good photographs of him, and I've got another one in the next presentation. And he operated his headquarters, you can see his bed in the back. His headquarters by this stage was effectively a jeep and a truck, and he commanded the entire division through 1944-45 in that manner. It's very important also that we've talked quite a bit about air superiority. Japanese movement on the roads and railway right across Burma was severely inhibited throughout 1945. 10th American Air Force, well, in fact, the entire Allied Air Force is called the Eastern Air Force under a chap called American General called General Stratmeyer, coordinated a series of strategic and operational campaigns against Japanese infrastructure in Burma that really dramatically debilitated Kimura during the critical stages of the campaign. These pictures, this picture in the middle from the left is actually from Arakan. We'll come back to Arakan later. These are photographs from the early 1945 campaign against Maiban. But this one down here is from the Irrawaddy a little bit later on, and this is also the Irrawaddy. So let me just give you a sense of what the change of plan was. So we just remember the first plan was to fight Kimura above the Irrawaddy with his 2 corps, 4 Corps and 33 Corps. And I'll just touch on one of the questions that I've got tonight from Rory. Rory says, given a historical perspective, was Scoons unfairly dismissed for moving too slowly during the early stages of Imphal? No, I don't think he was, Rory. And the reason I don't think he was is because he wasn't sacked at the end of Imphal. I think that it's very easy for us to look back and say, well, so-and-so didn't keep his job, therefore he was sacked. No, he wasn't. There was a very interesting process by which Slim, towards the end of 1944, so August, September, October, was choosing his corps and divisional commanders. And he said, who is best? Who will be best? Of all my A-team, my top 15, let's just call it that. Who is going to be best at conducting a fast, armor-centric, maneuver-based operation across Burma? Who's going to be not too risk-averse? Who's going to be experienced with armor? Who's going to be experienced at moving quickly and dramatically? And who's knackered and has had a really tough go of it so far? And, you know, Geoffrey Scoons was a good officer and a friend of Slim's, and he wasn't sacked. He just wasn't the most appropriate person to take 4 Corps forward in 1945. And the man who Slim judged was the best person to take him forward was Frank Messervy. So let's just have a look at the next slide, and I'll talk you through the plan. Now, without going into a huge amount of detail, because I know it can be quite distracting, I just want to tell you that this plan is one of the most dramatic plans of any British commander in the entirety of the Second World War. Now, that's not hyperbole, that's absolute fact. What Slim said to himself was, okay, I've got Kimura stuck up here on the Irrawaddy shore. I now know that he's going to back off across the Irrawaddy. He's going to fight around Mandalay. That is because Kimura thinks that Mandalay is the key to securing Burma. Slim looked at this, and being a very bright fellow, Slim said, I don't think Mandalay is the center to Burma, but I recognize that the entirety, or the focus for the Burma Area Army, which is the name given to Kimura's army, is Mandalay. What can I do to discombobulate? Here I'm using that word again. What can I do to discomfort Kimura in Mandalay? And he looked at Mandalay, which of course is up here. He looked at the Irrawaddy, and he looked at the rest of Burma, and he realized actually the place that was of real significance to the defense of Mandalay for Kimura was a nodal point where all his roads and his rail came together, and where a number of his airfields were, and where many of his administrative troops were, and that was a place called Meiktila, which is down here. And Slim said, if I can feint at Mandalay and pretend that I'm attacking Mandalay, and yet I come quietly down the side through the jungle, cross the Irrawaddy unnoticed, and come up from underneath or from alongside Meiktila and capture Meiktila, then Kimura is going to lose effectively his line of communication. He's going to lose his railway, he's going to lose his roads, he's going to lose his airfields, he's going to lose his ammunition dumps, he's going to lose everything that sustains his forward position in Mandalay. So Slim said, I've got 2 choices. I can continue to try to cross the Irrawaddy at Mandalay with my 33rd and 4th Corps, and I can have a massive battle on Kimura's terms on the Irrawaddy, where he knows that Kimura would try to defeat in detail all of the crossing points that Slim would throw across the Irrawaddy. Even if Slim was to throw 6 or 8 crossing points over the Irrawaddy, Kimura would fight for every one of them tooth and nail. Instead, Slim said, no, I don't need to do that. I need to do what we call maneuverist thinking. I'm going to fight Kimura where he's weakest. I'm going to feint in the north with the 33rd Corps. I'm going to take my main armored corps, the 4th Corps, and I'm going to take it through the jungle, and I'm going to attack Meiktila, and I'm going to smash Kimura at Meiktila. Well, it was a fantastic idea. It was a fantastic plan. And I'm afraid I'm going to let you in on a secret. It was also absolutely amazingly executed. Meiktila was one of the great battles of the Second World War. It was one of the great British battles of the Second World War. It's a marvelous place to walk around if we have a chance when we go next year. It's not the easiest of places to do. A couple of years ago, I had the amazing experience of driving from Rangoon, which is here, right across with some veterans from Hodson's Horse and their Sherman tanks to Meiktila. We won't be able to do that, I'm afraid. But the extraordinary thing was, this was a very, very risky plan, actually. So Slim had his 2 corps. Let's just quickly go through them. He had 33 corps in the north, with General Montague Stopford, who had commanded it, of course, through the Kohima offensive, and then down into the pushing the Japanese out through the Road of Bones. All these forces were reorganized as a consequence of this change of plan. So Montague Stopford had the 19th Indian Division under Pete Reese. He had the 20th Indian Division under Douglas Gracie. He had the 2nd British Division, a new divisional commander. Grover had gone and Nicholson had replaced him. He had a brigade of, 2 regiments of Lee Grant tanks, 254 Tank Brigade, and he had an independent Indian Infantry Brigade. And at the same time, you will remember from our chat about Michenar 2 days ago, he had the whole of Stilwell's advancing Northern Combat Area Command troops, primarily the 36th Indian Division, marching down the railway corridor, coming down here towards Mandalay. It's really up here through Mandalay. And the 36th Division would in due course meet up with the 19th and the 20th around Mandalay itself. So he had quite a significant force in the north. He reorganized himself to take the 4th Corps under Frank Messervy, which included the 7th Indian Infantry Division, the 17th. Now, this was now commanded by Geoffrey Evans. Remember, 7th Indian had been commanded by Frank Messervy in Arakan. It's now commanded by Geoffrey Evans, who incidentally wrote a very good book in the 1960s on Slim, called Slim as a Military Commander. He had the 28th East African Brigade, an independent East African Brigade. He also had 255 Tank Brigade, and the unique thing about 255 is they had the newly arrived Sherman tanks. These were to be an absolute godsend in Burma in 1945. And he had a group called the Lushai Brigade, which we won't spend much time talking about, but they played a very significant role in protecting the right flank of Messervy's approach. Now, that's all well and good. The most significant thing about, well, there are 2 really significant things about Slim's plan. The first is that he had to do it in secret. If at any stage Kimura realized or logged on to the fact that the whole of the 14th Army wasn't facing him north of Mandalay, he would clearly realize that they were up to something and would prepare defenses elsewhere along the Irrawaddy. So secrecy was paramount, and we don't have time to go into it, but secrecy, the enabling of secrecy through 1945 to support this operation was fantastically achieved. The second really incredible thing everyone needs to know is that when the 4th Corps was sent down towards Meiktila, it had to go down through the Gangor Valley. The Gangor Valley, some of you might know it as the Meiktila Valley, coming down to the left of Mogong. But there wasn't any more than a rough track through 300 miles of jungle through the Meiktila or Gangor Valley to Pakaku on the Irrawaddy, which is here. I mean, how on earth do you do that? Slim had to take a whole armored corps, building the road through the jungle as he went, all the while trying and hoping and praying not to be seen by Japanese aircraft, reconnaissance aircraft, or anything else. Because as soon as they saw this, if the Japanese saw what was going on, the game would be up. Well, the good news is, folks, Slim managed to get 4 Corps down that track, bulldozers in front of the Sherman tanks, Shermans driving down the road 300 miles, some of them on low loaders. It was an absolutely extraordinary achievement, to the extent that by early February, we had most of the 7th and 17th Indian Divisions, or parts of them, ready to cross the Irrawaddy. And some years ago, I had the amazing experience of accompanying men from Hodson's Horse and from the Lancashire Fusiliers who crossed at Nyanggu all those years ago as part of the bridgehead. Whilst that was going on, the 28th East India Brigade continued south to try to distract any Japanese attention from the actual location of the bridgeheads. So there we are. That was the plan, a really, really risky plan, but a great plan. If this could be achieved, this would really, really turn the table of chimera in Burma. Right, let's move on and see where we are. Well, what we have then is the battle for Meiktila. Don't worry about the very complicated slide. I'll quickly show you where we are. So Meiktila is down here. We've got the Irrawaddy running up here into Mandalay. We've got the crossing point at Nyanggu, which is here. Further north, we had a crossing point at Pakiku. But the essential, or the essence rather, of the attack, this Lee Grant section in the wrong place. This should be up around Mandalay. We needed to have a photograph of a Sherman there, so forgive me for getting that wrong. But I like this picture of Cowan, so he's back in our slide. Essentially, what happened was that Messevy's plan was to drive on to Meiktila as quickly as he could with his tanks without the Japanese having any sense of what was going on. So it was like a maneuver group from Germany, northwest France in 1940, and a bit like the operational maneuver groups that the Soviets used in 1944 and 45. So armored columns, integrated aircraft, artillery, mechanized infantry, moving together as a formidable fighting lance through the enemy's positions to get to a strategic objective. So this is AIDA 1942, again focusing on the strategic objective. And the strategic objectives: get to Meiktila. Don't worry about any fights that you could undertake before you get there. Just get to Meiktila. And the idea is, as soon as they got to Meiktila, the remainder of the 7th Indian Division would fly in by aircraft and land at a number of the airfields around Meiktila. The first is at the Butkong here, where my little red dot is at the moment. That was successfully achieved. So we ended up with the 7th and the 17th Indian Division surrounding and capturing Meiktila in the early days of March 1944. The shock of the capture of Meiktila was overwhelming for Kimura. He realized at a stroke that he had been outplayed. He turned around many of his forces in Mandalay to push them down on Meiktila and to try and smash their way against the British and Indian forces there and to force them out of the town. For a period of time during when this battle raged, which is effectively for most of March 1944, Indian and British forces, 7th and 17th Divisions, were cut off in Meiktila whilst the Japanese ranged around them. But counterattacks against the Japanese and aggressive operations from Meiktila out eventually smashed the Japanese counterattack and conclusively ended in Allied success. And I've said a number of times, you would have picked up by now, that the way in which the Allies were fighting very, very quickly was dramatically different to the fighting that they had been used to undertaking the previous year. So gone were these any sense of inferiority, gone were the boxes, gone was the jungle. What hadn't disappeared was aerial resupply, because what was happening now is that units were ranging far beyond their ability to be resupplied by road. There was no such thing as a road line of communication anymore. All ammunition, fuel, reinforcements came in by air. And one of the first things that brigades would do when they reached an area would be to flatten an area of ground to bring in the C-47s, the DC-3 Dakotas, to bring in reinforcements and ammunition and to fly out the wounded. It was a very, very slick operation, and all the lessons that have been learnt in Operation Thursday with the Chindits in particular, and also in Arakan, and again in support of Kohima and Imphal, were exploited here. The real essence of the 14th Army operations around Meiktila and Mandalay is one of extreme professionalism. And it's extraordinary, actually. There were very, very few fights here that didn't see the complete domination of the enemy by Indian, African, and British soldiers, even those soldiers who'd been fighting a long time in Burma. So the tables had completely turned on the Japanese. And whilst the Meiktila fighting was going on in the north, the 36th Division, the 19th Division, the 20th Division were pressing down against Mandalay. And at about the time that Meiktila was invested, the 2nd British Division came across the river here, about here. The 19th Division crossed to the north of Irrawaddy, and the 20th Division crossed almost opposite Mandalay. And Kimura had two fights on his hands. He had the fight for Mandalay and he had the fight for Meiktila, and he had to choose which one he was going to support the most. He eventually divided his forces and tried to fight two battles, which is exactly what Slim wanted him to do. So think about this in terms of maneuver. Maneuver is not necessarily about moving around on the ground, although it usually involves us, but the way in which soldiers tend to use the word maneuver is to say, well, how can I maneuver in time and space? How can I maneuver in the mind of the enemy commander so that I achieve my objective and he fails to achieve his? What can I do? And when I talk to soldiers about this, I describe the Battle of Mandalay and Meiktila, and I say, well, look, Slim could easily have fought and probably would have won a force-on-force confrontation around Mandalay, but it would have cost him lots of casualties, and it wouldn't have been as smart as what he did do, which was to move underneath, attack the enemy where he was weakest at Meiktila, and achieve an outstanding victory. So just think about this. We're now at the end of March 1945, and we're in the dry season, so it's very hot where we are here, but it's only 4 months since Slim crossed the Chindwin and had completed the process of clearing the Japanese out of India, and he's won a second great victory. The Battle of Mandalay and Meiktila, I always jump them together because even though they were separate battles, strategically they were won. So not only do we have Kohima and Imphal in 1944 as a dramatic victory that smashed the 15th Army, we now have essentially the Burma Area Army smashed around Mandalay and Meiktila. And what this ends up doing is it ends up with Kimura's forces streaming eastwards into the mountains of the Shan states and into the Karenai, which is where the Karen people live further south, and south towards Rangoon. So let's move on very quickly, and we're making good progress in terms of time. Just a very quick reminder that in January and February 1945, of course, we have very significant operations in Arakan, and it's an opportunity to remind you, of course, that the operations down the Caledon Valley by the wonderful 81st West African Division only had 2 brigades because one of those African brigades had gone off to reinforce Wingate's Chindits, where they did a marvelous job. But the operations in Arakan were very important as well. And just to remind you, they were important because they prevented the Japanese reinforcing central Burma through the An Pass and Tongup. They also meant that acquiring Akyab, Chiduba, and Ramri Islands would provide a stepping stone for the subsequent attacks, amphibious attacks on Rangoon, an operation known as Operation Dracula, and it also gave access to those airfields which would enable the direct bombing of Rangoon and also the support of aerial operations for troops in and around and moving down towards Rangoon. It's very, very important to remember, of course, that at the time that Slim was at Meiktila and Mandalay, he was at the extent of his own aerial lines of communication. Aircraft, he needed to capture those airfields around Mandalay and Meiktila in order to enable him to carry on down to Rangoon, and having the airfields in Akyab and Chindits were also and Ramri Island for that matter were very important. Okay, so here we are. We now have the race for Rangoon. And the race for Rangoon, quite extraordinary. Mountbatten's looking at this in February and saying to London, hey, you know, we think we've got a good chance of getting to Rangoon before the monsoon arrives in May or the early June. We might actually be able to achieve the successful reconquest of Burma. Well, of course, in London, remember, this is early 1945. They're fighting across the Rhine. They're working very hard to defeat Germany's empire. And if anyone in London really knew where Mandalay was, they were an exception to the rule. People, of course, had heard of Rangoon, but is this particularly important? And it's also quite interesting, actually, when you look at the correspondence between London and Kandy, which is in Ceylon, where Mountbatten was. It was largely one-way traffic. So long as Mountbatten was able to assert explicitly some imperative that he needed to achieve, it was generally agreed. So Mountbatten said to London, we won't need Operation Dracula. This is February. We won't need Operation Dracula. Slim's going to be there in time. Slim then looked at the operation that he had to undertake to go from Mandalay and Meiktila down to Rangoon. It's basically the distance from Paris to Marseille. Any of you have done that journey? It's a long way. It's not going to happen in short time. And he had to fight through all the remnants, the detritus of the Burma Area Army, all of whom were prepared to fight and die for their emperor. And although they'd been defeated around Meiktila, there is no way you can ever say the Japanese army was defeated to the extent they'd stopped fighting. The only time they ever stopped fighting was when their emperor told them to, after the 15th of August 1945. So Slim had a very, very significant job on his hands. And Slim then went back to Mountbatten and said, I'm going to go to Rangoon or bust, but I also want Dracula to take place. Mountbatten agreed, and the Operation Dracula, which involved a brigade of parachute troops landing on Elephant Point and an amphibious operation against Rangoon at the same time as Slim was coming down the road from the north. So what about that road from the north? Well, think about the point that we've been making around strategic imperatives and focusing on your objective. Well, Slim's objective clearly was Rangoon. Interestingly enough, Kimura's objective now was also Rangoon. Tokyo told him that the important thing was to make sure that Rangoon was held. And Slim had to get there very quickly. There were a number of routes, which is basically a reversal of 1942. So he'd come down the road from Toungoo. The railway also went through Toungoo. Remember, Toungoo was where 200 Chinese division was in April, the great battle between in late April 1942. And if he could get to Toungoo, he'd have a clear run at Rangoon. The problem with Toungoo was that as he was facing it, he's facing it from the north. Toungoo sits on the edge of the Korean hills, and they were full, chock-a-block full of Japanese. The Japanese would defend Toungoo to the death. So Slim had to get to Toungoo as quickly as he could. He gave Messervy his head and told Messervy just to get down there. And at the same time as this was going on, he also authorized, and Mountbatten authorized, operations by the Special Operations Executive, known in the Far East as Force 136, to arm the local Karen guerrillas in particular, but I'll talk about that in a moment. They weren't all Karen, many of them were Burmans. In fact, the majority of them were Burmans. In order to be able to fight against the Japanese in a guerrilla type series of operations in March and April and May 1945. And the primary operation by Force 136 in the area around Toungoo in this area, in this time, April 1945, was called Operation Character. And in my view, it proved dramatically successful and was one of the reasons why Slim was able to achieve the victory he achieved in 1945. And the character area of operations is the one, the SOE operations in Burma. So we're rushing down here from Mandalay and Meiktila, and we're coming down to Rangoon. Well, this is the series of, this is the area of on the map where character and its separate components, subcomponents, fought the Japanese. About 2,000 guerrillas, supported by about 100 British and Indian and Burmese leaders, were parachuted in to raise essentially the native army to fight the Japanese. And they ambushed them, they closed roads, they killed lots of them. In fact, the Operation Character killed more Japanese in the period to May 1945 than conventional operations. It's a fantastic example of how guerrilla operations undertaken in conjunction with the operations of conventional forces can be dramatically successful. Operation Character. And one of my friends, Dr. Richard Duckett, has done a huge amount of work on this area. I'm hugely indebted to Richard for his work. And you can read his book, SOE in Burma, which is fabulously well written and brilliantly researched. It's opened up for the first time a really new perspective on what went on in Burma in 1945 that was largely hidden. This photograph of the Lysander supporting Operation Character is one of the things that Richard's managed to find. So there are lots and lots of parallels with what was going on in Europe, but character was one of those things that no one really knows anything about, but was fundamental to the success of the 14th Army. Incidentally, Slim pays huge credit to the men of Force 136 for their success in 1945. So what we have is that just as the rains come, and I've talked about the rains before, the rains in Burma need to be seen to be believed. And the rains came down quite early, end of April 1945, slowed Slim's move down through Tungu and the road to Rangoon. But just as the rains came, the amphibious Operation Dracula came in at the coast, and Kimmerer realized he was going to be cut off, and Rangoon was going to be captured, and he evacuated the city. And this famous photograph here, I'll go back a slide. This is Rangoon jail full of British and Allied POWs. You can see the words on one of the roofs, extract digit, a message to the Royal Air Force and anyone who was watching to pull your finger out, because the Japanese had gone. There we are, Japs gone, and a lone bow fighter landed at Mingalodon Airfield. The pilot hitched a ride into Rangoon and was told that the Japanese had gone. And that's essentially the story of 1945. There's a map here, which I had drawn for one of my books many years ago, which basically pulls the whole story together. And this all happened essentially in 5 months. And it is very interesting actually to see this as a reversal of 1942. 1942 happened all in about 5 months, and the reconquest took about the same amount of time. We are talking about very, very much larger numbers of troops, of course, being involved now. We think that at this time in 1945, the Japanese had over 300,000 troops in Burma. At all stages of the fight in 1945, the Japanese had more troops in Burma than Slim had. But Slim had a better army, he had a better trained army, he had a fully integrated army, he had an army that was integrated around mechanized infantry, artillery, and tanks, and seamlessly locked in to his aerial line of communication. And the entire story of the campaign in Burma in 1945 is a story of a supremely organized, well-led, well-organized offensive operation in the Second World War, completely forgotten about, not really paid any attention to by anyone else. But at the time, the soldiers in Burma in 1945, of course, as you all know, consider themselves to be entirely forgotten. And these great victories that were achieved at a time when Germany was about to surrender, because Germany surrendered early May. So here we have this great victory in Burma happening under everyone else's radar. No one knew what was going. No one in Europe knew if they cared. They certainly didn't know. They didn't really care much either. But it's worth resurrecting. This is an incredibly, incredibly extraordinary story of victory, given the context of dramatic defeat in 1942. So when we all go out here next year or whenever we can, I would like to take you down to Mulmine, way down here. We'll spend a bit of time in Rangoon. It's a bit of a difficult country for tours because you have to flit around a bit and it messes up with the chronology. It's very difficult indeed to go from Imphal and Tambu into India. Some people have done it, but it's not easy to do for organized tours. It's very, very complicated. It's bad enough going from Imphal to Kohima. So what I think I'd like to do is just focus on Burma, go to Mulmine, do this journey here, which is an extraordinary one. If I can fly from Rangoon, we still haven't sorted that out. I mean, I would love to be able to fly from Rangoon to Mulmine and then drive back over the Setang. And then going up the Setang to Toungoo and spending a bit of time in Toungoo and seeing the challenges faced by the poor old Chinese Fifth Army in 1942, spending a little bit of time in Meiktila, spending a little bit of time in Mandalay, but also going up the Chinwan to Kaliwa up here. And if we do have time, flying up to Myitkyina and driving across to Mokong and doing a little bit of the railway corridor. This is the railway corridor coming down here to Indore. And you get an amazing sense of the entire campaign in 10, 12, 14 days. Right. Looking at the time, let's move on. And I'm now going to flick presentations. If I can do it, I'm going to have to get out of that one and give you my last one. So see if I can do this. Right.
Rob, just while you're doing that,
yeah.
Just to add on, also echo, to your point. So in the past, Sampan haven't done Imphal and Kohima as part of our tours, but we are hoping to do that in the future. So there's one particularly very good company based up around Imphal and Kohima who we're going to be working with as we go forward, because I know for a lot of people who do these tours, they want Imphal and Kohima as well as the Burma sites. So we are already working on itineraries to how to incorporate those places into a Burma tour for those that are interested. And I'll speak a little bit more about that at the end of the session.
And the company is fantastic, and Bertie and I know everyone involved, and they're first class. Let me just have a drink.
Yeah, they're really good, and obviously now all those borders are closed, but it is getting easier as time goes on to go between the two countries. So we will try and incorporate that into the tour for those that wish to add on those sites. But I'll hand over back to you again, Rob.
Okay, well, why don't we just spend the next 20 or 30 minutes? I'll try and answer some of the questions that have been sent through. Some very good questions, by the way. Let's just, and what I had always intended to do here was just to give some impressions and reflect on the campaign that we've been through together. And so nothing here will surprise you. And they're in no particular order either. So why don't we just talk them through as I come up with them. And the first thing I think I probably need to say is that, war is such a terrible thing. You never get a historian of war or a military historian, however you call us, who will ever, or even an ex-soldier who glories in war. And one of the terrible things about the Burma campaign was the terrible suffering that came as a consequence of the invasion in 1942. And it's important to remember, actually, the war, when it began, actually in December 1941 for the Western Allies in the Far East, had been going on for a long time. It had been going on since 1937 in China. And the best estimates, Rana Mehta thinks that the man who I suggested we all read his book about the Chinese War, that about 20 million Chinese civilians died as a consequence of the war that the Japanese had begun in 1937. It's an extraordinary number. In Burma itself, we had the enforced diaspora of the Indian population, and Hugh Tinker wrote a paper on this way back in the 1970s, where he estimated about 100,000. More recent calculations of people who died, more recent calculations suggest it's something between 50 and 70,000. But a terrible trauma was applied to the Indian expatriate community in India in particular, who had no other way of escaping than by foot and bullock cart, as you can see here. But it's very interesting, actually, that the Japanese absolutely messed up their occupation of Burma. And we don't have time to go into it tonight, but as a consequence of the Japanese occupation, ham-fisted military occupation, lots of Burmese people themselves starved, to the extent that by 1944, the groundswell of popular support that was lent to the Japanese in 1942 had entirely gone. I mean, entirely gone. To the extent that Aung San, who was slightly more communistic than the other Baekun leaders, completely took his army over, the Burma Defense Army, over to Slim's side in March 1945 to fight against the Japanese, and most other Burmese nationalists of all stripes in 1945 supported the British as the first step of achieving the removal of the Japanese and the recovery of their country for themselves. So it's always something worthwhile reminding ourselves with as we study war, particularly in these areas, that there is always an innocent bystander caught up in this fighting. I've spent a lot of time talking and working alongside Nagas, people of Nagaland, and they were in exactly the same situation. They didn't ask or invite the war that arrived in their mountaintop homes in March and April 1944. They lived with it, and their stories are quite extraordinary themselves. And it also had another dimension in that it was intensely political for these countries, because both Burma, as you know, and India, of course, were British colonies. They were both governed quite differently for many, many years. Burma, which had been acquired as a colony really in order to protect India's interests in 1885. Burma and India had been poor neighbors for a very, very long time. And 1937, Burma rather received a degree of independence from Burma, but it was ruled as with a governor appointed from London. The same Secretary of State for India was the Secretary of State for Burma, Leo Amery, at the start of the war. And the war itself from 1942, let's just say 42, when the Japanese arrived on land, and 1945, was a war for the future of both Burma and India. And we don't have any time to spend talking about this tonight. It's a fantastic new dimension, or it's a fantastic dimension rather, to the story about the struggle. But I think it's a dimension that needs to be given greater prominence than it has, because what it does is it takes the story about the fighting away from simply the tactics and the dispositions and the organization of war. It looks at the purpose of the fighting. Why were the Indians, why did 2.5 million young Indian men join the Indian Army, of all things? Were they fighting to preserve the Raj? Or were they just fighting to preserve the government of India? And they weren't particularly concerned whether that government was run by Britons or not. Were they even thinking about the future? I know that some were. The evidence is very clear that Indians joined the army for many, many reasons. The primary reason was that they wanted to stop the threat of the Japanese. And it's very, very interesting here, because there's an entire story here about the transformation of the Indian Army as an entity within India itself. In 1939, the Indian Army was a very small mercenary army. And I think I'm right to use that phrase. I'm borrowing other people's use of it as well. It was an army that was recruited from a very small number of small areas of India, and it was designed for British purposes. The primary role of the Indian Army in 1939 was to provide support to the British Army wherever that might be deployed around the world. 1945, a very different situation existed. The Indian Army had grown so dramatically, it recruited in a way that now reflected a different sort of India. It wasn't the old India of 1939, the Indian Army 1939. So it reflected a wider base. And it was one of those mature institutions of society that all independent countries need. I would suggest, actually, that what many Indians were doing in 1944 and 45 was fighting for the India that they wanted to have themselves. They weren't fighting, certainly for the Raj, they weren't fighting for yesterday's India, they were fighting for the future. And that political dimension is very important. It's much easier to see that in terms of Burma because we actually had died in the war Burmese nationalists, communists, and all sorts of different stripes coming over voluntarily to fight for the British to be able to defeat the Japanese as the first step in achieving a conversation about independence for themselves. It was also intensely political in respect of Allied strategy, and we spent a little bit of time talking about this great nexus between China, Britain, and America, where America seemed to have aligned itself to China's interests. It's very interesting that that's not actually the case. I think America had aligned itself to what it thought China's interests were. We need to understand that China had been largely in civil war since 1912. The two great competing imperatives in China was the government, the Kuomintang government under this gentleman here, and the communists under Mao Zedong. When the Americans looked at China, they looked at it through a particularly American lens, and that relationship is a fascinating one. And of course, we had a relationship between Britain and China that was particularly fractious. So in 1942, we have these imperatives coming together and managing those different dynamics through the period 42 to 45 from an allied grand strategic perspective is absolutely fascinating. There are a number of very good books on the subject. How do you hold an alliance together, a fractious alliance together, with single strategic objectives actually driven by competing national objectives? Quite extraordinary. I mean, we think, just going back to that, we think how difficult it was getting Britain and the United States to agree on a strategy for Europe. I mean, that was hard enough. Getting them to agree on the strategy for the Far East, very, very tough indeed. I've made the point. I love this photograph of the Flying Tigers, these Curtiss Flying Tiger aircraft over northern Burma. First duty of any government is protection of citizens, and then that is where the British government failed in Burma in 1942. It's really as simple as that. General Aida's two divisions managed to smash its way into Burma because there was no prepared opposition. I mean, we can go on about it and explain the detail of how unprepared Britain was. But if you're going to have a colony or you're going to have a government, if you've got responsibilities as a government, the first thing you need to do is make sure that you protect the people. We've made this comment a number of times, and it's something that I'm very keen to continually stress, which is that for strategy to be successful, it needs to be accompanied by workable plans. And throughout the early days in the Burma campaign, and I put this up here because I think Operation Thursday was also flawed. I think what the Chindits achieved was extraordinary, and I don't disagree with the use of the LRP concept in Burma. But the idea is that you first of all have to secure your strategic objective. And remember, what is a strategic objective? A strategic objective is something that enhances your strategy. Your strategy is to defeat the Japanese in Burma, or to remove the Japanese from Burma, or to secure Rangoon. It might be a geographical imperative. Whatever that strategy is, you then have to build up plans that work. There is no point having plans that don't add to or contribute to that strategic imperative. Remember, a strategic imperative could also be to persuade the enemy to do something that he wouldn't otherwise do. And there are a number of examples here through 1942, 1943 in Arakan. The Chindits are a classic example, 1944. where the plans weren't aligned to the strategy. There's such a lot you can learn from the Burma campaign. Another thing that sort of struck me this afternoon as I was preparing tonight's presentation was, in order to prepare for war, you absolutely need to understand your enemy. And I think the great failing of the interwar years for Britain in particular was its foolish introversion. It focused on itself, and it tried to design means of war fighting and structures and approaches to war that were designed on wishful thinking. They were designed on the way in which Britain thought the war would be fought. And of course, that war was a reflection of how we fought the last war. And this is a claim, it's a jibe often thrown out at soldiers, that you're preparing to fight the last war. It was very clear that actually there was a lot that we could have learned about the Japanese, about how they fought, about their modus operandi, about their weapons, about their what they were doing in China. We ignored it all. So that in 1942 and 1943, we are constantly surprised by things that should not have surprised us. And it's embarrassing, actually, reading many of the reports about 1942, because in many respects, the Chinese army, Imperial Japanese Army, not Chinese Army, the Imperial Japanese Army was remarkable, and it was powerful, and it was well led, and it was quite a considerable force in battle. But it wasn't the be all and end all, and made lots and lots of mistakes. The Chinese in particular, Chengdu in 1938 had defeated the Japanese in battle, and there are a number of and the Japanese had been howled by the Chinese for a number of years in China, and yet it's not fair just to call it racism. It was certainly ignorance on the Allied side, both British and American side, that it completely ignored the Japanese army prior to 1942. And by goodness gracious me, were we surprised. Right, the other thing that won't surprise any of you is that war is a battle of egos. And let me go back to that. And I've just thrown 3 up there. All these people had massive egos. We are Wingate, Mutaguchi, and Noel Irwin. And you know, if you're a strategic commander, you're a Mountbatten or a Gifford or a Leese, and above all that, you're a Churchill, who, of course, you won't need reminding, was the Minister of State for Defence. He was the Defence Minister in the UK as well as being the Prime Minister. You've got to manage these competing egos, and it's quite extraordinary the military and the political environments that enable these egos to arrive and to dominate. It was very good fortune that for the British, most of those egos were managed in one way, shape, or form. Wavell was able to sack Irwin, and Slim was able to control Wingate, and that's quite clear. He was able to do that in quite a dramatic fashion. Mutaguchi was largely out of control. Pyawbwe wasn't smart enough to manage Mutaguchi, and Mutaguchi couldn't manage any of his divisional commanders. As a historian has mentioned, described, you know, the Japanese went into war squabbling with each other and exited it fighting and squabbling and losing the war as a consequence. It is extraordinary. The more you look at it, the more you see the Second World War. You can see the Second World War was a failure of Japanese leadership right across the piece, because they didn't know how to coordinate their strategic and their leadership functions at all. And Mutaguchi and the Sato debacle is a clear case in point. One of the things that I have really realized over the last year in writing my new book on the Burma Campaign, A War of Empires, hopefully published November next year, 2021, is that it was largely an Indian war. Now, in 1945, the 14th Army was 606,000 men strong. 87% of those 606,000 men were Indian soldiers. 3% were Africans, with West and East Africans, and exactly 10% were British. So we have the sense, perhaps, that the 14th Army was a British army, the Slim's army, It wasn't. The 14th Army was an Indian army, formerly part of the Southeast Asian Command, part of the Indian Army, and the men who fought by and large in 1944 and 45 to defeat the Japanese invasion of India and to recover Burma in 1945 were Indians. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that there were ethnic or racial divides in the 14th Army. There weren't. It was a completely integrated army. Ethnically, and Slim goes to great pains to explain that in his book. It's a fabulous book, Defeat into Victory. But in terms of numbers, it's very clear that Burma in 1940, Assam and Manipur in 1944, and Burma in 1945 would not happen without the resurrection of the Indian Army. And if anyone wants to go into a bit more detail, there's an absolute seminal book by Daniel Marston, Professor Daniel Marston. It was his PhD, and it was produced, I think, in about 1996, or might be a bit after that, called Phoenix from the Ashes, which is basically the story of how a defeated army in 1942 became a all-consuming, all-powerful victorious army in 1945. And that's something that actually, over some of you might have heard me on BJ Day and other TV programs will hear me talk about this fact that actually India as a whole doesn't tend to regard the Burma campaign as part of its history. It regards Burma in 1945 as part of colonial history. Anything before 1947 is often seen by the Indians as colonial history, not their own history. But there is a growing groundswell of opinion in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, which is reversing that view. And there's a lot of interest in India now in the pre-partition unsegregated Indian army based around their success in Burma, which is a very good thing for me. You've heard me talk a couple of times about strategic effect, and I've just make the observation that some more noisy operations have drowned out other equally deserving ones. And of course, you know what I mean. Operation Thursday, so the second Chindit expedition with Wingate, has tended to take all the credit. If you ask the man on the Clapham omnibus about the Burma campaign, he'll say, if he knows anything about it all, he'll say, oh, wasn't that the Chindit campaign? So the Chindits sort of dominate everything with regard to the Burma campaign, and that's fine. But actually, there are other aspects of long-range penetration that deserve mention, and I can't be blamed for not mentioning either that the 81st West African Division in the Culloden Valley in Arakan, 1944-45, nor indeed Operation Character in the Karen Hills in April 1945, because they were the three classic examples of long-range penetration. There is another example in the Lushai States, in the Lushai Brigade, in the pursuit of Mutaguchi's army from Manipur in 1944, but it's relatively small. The three major LRP operations are these three here. And when we consider Burma, I would argue that actually Character probably had more strategic effect than Thursday. Thursday killed more Japanese, actually about the same number of Japanese were killed. About 5,000 Japanese were killed by Wingate's raiders in Thursday, and about 5,000 by Operation Character. But remember that point about strategy. What is the thing that is being changed the most? Slim needs to get to Rangoon. If he can stop the Japanese getting to Toungoo, he will achieve that. If he doesn't achieve that, and the Japanese hold on to Toungoo, then Kimura will be able to hold Rangoon through the wet season, and that would deny the British the opportunity of an amphibious assault. So actually, in terms of strategic importance and strategic effect, it's clear to me that Operation Character was more important than Operation Thursday, whose sole job was to occupy the 18th Division, attacking and supporting General Stilwell and Michener. Right. I've really gone on to this question around, was Operation Thursday worthwhile? A very good friend of mine very recently sent me something I'd never seen before, which is a lecture given in 1946 by Joe Lintain, who commanded the 111th Brigade in Operation Thursday, and he wasn't pro or anti Wingate. He was a very proficient soldier, very experienced soldier, had been involved as a battalion commander in 1942 in the 17th Indian Division. Very brave man. Anyway, Joe Lintain said that in his view, Operation Thursday was absolutely worth it. The big question is, I suppose, whether it has been given the credit for things over and above that which is really due. But he said, we identified some 22 Japanese battalions as against our 19. These 22 battalions might otherwise have been used in the Imphal front. It made that Jap offensive decisive. And I think he's right. But it was an expensive schooling. So that's another question. And we're nearing the end now. Some of you have made the observation quite correctly about the criticality of achieving air superiority. None of the massive aerial resupply operations that took place in Assam, Manipur, and Burma in 42-45 could possibly have happened without the aerial resupply provided by the C-47s, and indeed protected by Spitfires, Hurricanes, Mustangs, and a whole series of other, these are Mustangs, these are other aircraft in the Eastern Air Force. We mustn't also lose sight of the criticality of mastering demands of logistics and administration. A couple of photographs of wounded Americans in this case. I think this is Michenar. I think it's Michenar. It might not be, but it doesn't matter. Being loaded up and flown back to India for medical treatment. The medical treatment facilities, forward ambulances, forward field hospitals were absolutely essential for keeping morale up and for minimizing the total number of casualties, Allied casualties during the war. And of course, this is something that the Japanese really just didn't have. And I've made the comment about the Japanese inability to support the needs of their soldiers right through the war. Really terrible for any modern army to behave as they did. And the final slide I want to mention is basically a reiteration of the point that I was making earlier in the previous presentation around the point about maneuvering someone's mind. This is avoiding battle where necessary. This particular fellow on the left-hand side is Punch Cowan, and of course the chap on the right is Slim. The classic example of maneuver was Aida holding the 17th Indian Division when racing to the Setang in January, February 1942. As I said on the first day, you'll remember Aida didn't need to defeat the British in battle in detail. He merely needed to discombobulate them, to confuse them, to worry them, and to move his 33rd Division around the outside to get to Meiktila and Setang first, and then focus on Rangoon. Irwin couldn't grasp this concept in Arakan. Irwin thought that the epitome of military excellence was battle and fighting the Japanese in battle and proving who was the better soldier. It's not true. Wars aren't won by battles. Wars are won by the maneuvering that takes place to persuade an enemy that they are defeated. Slim, as I've described tonight, perfected this maneuver concept brilliantly. He didn't have to prove to Kimura that the 33rd and the 4th Corps could smash Kimura's Burma area army at Mandalay. He avoided a lot of the bloodshed by having that fantastic discombobulating attack on Meiktila that was very, very successful in persuading Kimura that it was the masterstroke of Allied strategy. I'm quoting Kimura here, the masterstroke of Allied strategy. I mean, to an extent, he was embarrassed, and but he was giving credit where credit was due. This was a dramatic success by Slim. And some of you who know your Sun Tzu or know your Clausewitz will know that this is what ancient philosophers about this subject have always said. The epitome of the great general is the man or woman, perhaps, who can win without fighting. And that's the way that Slim fought his war in 1944-45, and it's the way in which he fought his war in Aida fought his war in 1942. Let's try and win Burma for the Japanese cause without doing all the sort of fighting that's going to cause lots of horrible bloodshed and casualties. Right, now, I think I've neared the end. You're all getting bored of me now. Imagine what it's going to be like on a 4-hour bus journey. I can assure you that I sit down and I rest for lots of it. But let me just answer some of these questions. Could anyone other than Slim have managed Stilwell and Wingate? Probably not. I mean, Slim was quite a remarkable man. I mean, he was a very calm human being. He didn't get excited about things. Both Stilwell and Wingate were excitable creatures. And it is fascinating. I love the question. There was some Rory here. That only really Slim could have managed Stilwell and Wingate in the way that he did. Stilwell didn't want to serve under any other British commander, but he wanted to serve under Slim, even though he was in a completely different level in the hierarchy. Wingate said of Slim that he's the only man this side of the Chinwin who understands me. Slim and Wingate actually had quite a number of really, really intense conversations around the construction of the forces for Operation Thursday that you can read about elsewhere. Did Slim ever get full acknowledgement from Churchill and Ellenbrook? No, the truth is he never did. The only reason that Slim eventually, at the end of the war, Slim went back to the UK and retired from the army, became deputy chairman of British Rail. And that was called forward when Attlee won the election and Churchill was lost it. And Montgomery was the chief of the Imperial General Staff under Attlee. Montgomery was going off to be to have a job in the nascent NATO, and Attlee had, for some reason, I still haven't got to the bottom of this. I don't think anyone has, knew about Slim and said, I want Bill Slim to be the new chief of the Imperial General Staff. Well, he'd be the first Sepoy general, Indian Army officer ever to have that role. Churchill, when he heard the news, said, Slim, that's not the proper name for a general. Montgomery had offered the job to his deputy, a chap called Crockett, famous good soldier. And Clem Attlee looked at Montgomery and said, well, you're going to have to untell him. And Slim became chief of the Imperial General Staff. There's a question from Robert White about Grandpa Longlegs, Hugh Seagram. Hugh Seagram was caught up in the Shan States during the retreat in 1942, wasn't able to get out. The British knew he was there, but he had no means of communicating. A Force 136 operation was launched to try to make contact with him later in 1943, was successful. And Hugh Seagram, great story. I can't spend too long on it now. Basically, took the war to the Japanese with some of his Karen fighters, but the Japanese led a massive hunt for him. Eventually, caught some Karen fighters and killed them, and then threatened to kill lots of others unless Seagram surrendered. Seagram surrendered and was captured taken by the Japanese, and was executed in Rangoon jail, and not very happily. The last question by Robert is about ethnic groups. Well, look, if you'd asked me this question 6 months ago, I would have said, yep, hill tribes all supported Britain, Burmese didn't. Do you know what? That's not true. It might have been true in 1942, but I mentioned Richard Duckett. I haven't got one of Richard's books here. Richard Duckett has written some very, undertaken some very, very compelling research on SOE. And what he's done is he's identified from the records exactly the ethnic breakdown of every single man who joined SOE in 1944-45. And he's discovered that the majority of them were, hold it, wait for it, Burmans. So the Burmese of the plains, the people who we the British thought were our natural enemy in 1942. It's not true. It's very, very important to remove those prejudices. That may well have been true in 1942. It certainly wasn't true in 1945. And it's quite interesting to see the motivations for Aung San and his BDA, for lots of young men, the Burmans, to join SOE. and others to take up arms in support of the anti-Japanese movement, in the same way that happened in Malaya as well in 1944-45. I think those are the only questions that I've received. There might be others. If you're still awake and you're still interested in talking, I'm very happy to take any final questions. Remember, you can always email me, do it through Bertie. I've got some of your email addresses, or start reading things up and banking your questions, and we'll talk about them on the bus next year.
Rob, thank you. Brilliant as ever. We do have a couple of questions that have come in while you've been speaking. One on Slim to start with.
Sorry, say it again, Bertie.
A question on Slim from Edward. He's asking if your perception of Slim has changed since you wrote your book on him all those years ago, and how it's developed.
Do you know what? That was my PhD, and I spent many years on it. My view of Slim has deepened dramatically. He really was an extraordinary man, and there is no way on earth that the Allies could have won Burma back without Slim. You know, I laugh at this concept about the great man of history, Carlyle, and so on, and how Weber was looking for the great man to command the Burma army. The truth is, great men are really important, great men or women. And in the case of the 14th Army, Slim was the perfect man, because the first thing Slim did in 1942 rather, is he sat down and he said, why were we beaten? Let's try and create the intellectual framework to understand the reasons for failure, to build a structure for success. He was a thinking soldier. Men liked him, officers liked him. He had it all together. He was a remarkable man. So I have to work very, very hard as a historian to see people warts and all, and see Slim warts and all. But it's a very, very fine line for me.
Malcolm's also put a question through, Rob. He says, is he right in thinking that the Japanese did not pursue the Allied forces after Yan'an Chow in 42 as hard as Slim pursued the Japanese?
No, that's not true. No, not at all. I mean, Defeat and Victory is a very good book that describes that. The Japanese 33rd Division worked very hard. They were, you know, my phrase about the coattails, the Japanese were on Slim's coattails all the way through to the last tank went across at Shegwin Basin. No, the Japanese were fighting all the way. The Japanese nearly discombobulated Slim in Moniwa as well. It was hard. The Japanese, after Yan'an Chong, the Japanese pushed very, very hard. And on a number of occasions, they could significantly have embarrassed Slim in 1942. Okay,
thank you, Rob. And finally, just for Malcolm, actually for me, will Aung San Suu Kyi win the next election? Yes, I think that's a...
Well, I was going to say, I was wondering whether the Donald would win in the United States, and if he didn't, maybe he'd come to Burma.
Well, they're happening in the same week, so God knows. I think the Myanmar one might lose some attention from whatever happens over in America. But no, I think she looks to have another big majority.
Yeah, she'll have a massive majority. None of you will know this, and probably Bertie doesn't as well. But many years ago, when Aung San Suu Kyi was the darling of the Western liberal world, I had this line that she was, like her father, a nationalist. And I was part of the Burma Society here, and we had lots of interesting conversations around it. And my judgment was borne out by events. It's very important that we understand, like the Americans didn't really understand China in 1940, 41, 42. They created a China of their imagining. We in the West created a Burma of our imagining. And when we created leaders who we thought would represent the liberal concept of our imagined Burma, and it's just not true.
Do you know Dr. Tan Mien Oo, Rob, the historian based out? Yeah, so
he and I correspond.
Okay, lovely. Well, his latest book came out this year, and it's a very good breakdown of the modern history of Burma.
Yeah, and
And
I've got it, I've used it, and I think he's a very balanced. He's balanced because he spent most of his life in New York. But I mean that's the but it's great, yes. And I would recommend anyone to read that. They want to have a sense of what's going on, what has gone on in Burma.
it's very good. Look, ladies and gents, we are going to finish there. No more questions coming in. I'm just going to thank Rob so much for all his efforts this week. We're so lucky to have had him lead us through the campaign over the last 7 days. I've received a lot of your comments from the guests about how much they've enjoyed each session and how informative it's been. And I know that, I mean, clearly you're a master in your field and your knowledge is vast, but there's a lot of work that you've had to put in to condense our knowledge and to create these presentations for us each day. So I really appreciate that, and I'm sure I speak for everyone when I thank you for what how you've led us this week. It's been fantastic, really
Thank
good.
You, I've really enjoyed it. I've enjoyed meeting you all, and I've enjoyed engaging with your questions. And I look forward to being with you next year. There's nothing quite like going on a 2-week tour of Burma. So start counting those shekels, and we'll get it sorted.
Exactly. So, like as I was going to say, Rob and I had planned to do our flagship Forgotten War Tour this March, and that was cancelled last minute. Rob was actually in country, and it got cancelled last minute due to the pandemic. So as soon as it's possible, and I know some of you actually on the tour today were packing your bags and soon to join us for that tour. As soon as it's possible and safe to do so, we are really keen to get as many of you as possible out to Myanmar to walk these roads and to get a real sense of what we've gone through this week in the country. Rob has already put together an itinerary which we'll keep working on, and as and when we can pencil in a date, we will do that, and we will notify you of that. Later this week, I probably will send you all the itinerary as it stands now and just where we are in that planning process, just so you can have a look at it and have a taste of what a tour with us would be like. And as soon as we can, we will hope to host you out here and visit all these places that Rob has taken us through this week. So thank you all. Thank you for joining us on this tour. It's our first virtual tour, and thank you for having a certain amount of trust in Sampan to run a virtual tour. And I hope that despite the snag yesterday, that it has been a successful tour for you all. We are going to do some more virtual tours in the new year in a different sort of format and different aspects of Myanmar. We might look at cuisine and martial arts, and maybe even dip our toes cautiously into Burmese politics. They will also be outlined on the website, and I'll send you details of those as well if you want to join us again virtually for another aspect of Myanmar. As Rob says, do get in touch with me but any further questions or comments about the tour, and I'll try and pass on all that's relevant to Rob for him to get back to you on those points. But it's been a really enjoyable week having you all here. Thank you to Rob, thank you to all of you, and hope to see you out in Myanmar in the near future.
Don't forget your hats, really important.
And I'll get mine as well. Thank you all very much, and good night. All the best.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.